to a user called Energy Sector. These will be collated and addressed in a Q&A session after the main presentation. Now, our mission here today is to tackle the ongoing uncertainty regarding supply adequacy and load shedding. This is an issue that has been further mystified by demand downturn during the COVID-19 pandemic due to the shutdown of commercial and industrial activities. Such uncertainty has created a negative ripple effect through the economy by eroding investor confidence and causing shocks to business revenues. It is hence GreenCape's intention that by increasing the reach of the CSIR's research of the current status and future trajectory of national supply, end users and investors will be able to make informed decisions and contribute to coordinated resilience action, whether this be at the customer scale via embedded generation and rooftop PV, or through the various utility scale procurement processes. I will now hand over to Jared Wright, Principal Engineer at the CSIR, to present their research.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm hoping you can hear me. I'm going to introduce myself as well as my colleague, Joanne Collins. So my name is Jared Wright. I'm a principal researcher at the CSIR Energy Centre. And this is some work that we actually published towards the beginning of this year, but of course it has a lot more relevance now, considering COVID, our lockdown that we had. But as we returned back and the demand returned back, the systemic issues that were there still exist. So Joanne, if you could just introduce yourself.
Afternoon, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I am Joanne Collins, and I'm working as a senior engineer in the Energy Centre at the CSIR. I co-authored this work with Jared, which he will be presenting today. I hope you enjoy it. And over to you.
Thanks, Joanne. So like I said, it's some work that we actually published at the beginning of this year, but we've provided a bit more context around the impact of COVID-19 and the lockdown on our demand, and also how that has returned, which you'll start to see come through in some of the work that we present. So while we did this, I think some people have seen this work before, but we just wanted to really reiterate the reason that we did this and why we made this contribution is feel like as an independent research organization that we should have no vested interest in any outcomes and provide that independent evidence base from which various industry stakeholders can use to inform their plans going forward. Number two, transparency. In a lot of ways over the last few years, we've published all of the work that we've done, including the data, the modeling frameworks and the analytics that sits behind it. So we want to make sure that we're as transparent as possible in the work that we do and really get the information out into the public domain. We also have a lot of experience and expertise ranging from grid planning to energy planning to experts that have been in system operations for many years. And we would like to think that we're that independent arbiter of information and a publicly trusted institution. We also thought at the time, but it's also still important now, that of course there was a lot of expedience that needed to go with it. We were in an electricity crisis. We still are in an electricity crisis, and we'll start to talk to that now in the next few slides. So we wanted to answer three key questions. Number one, are we in an electricity crisis? I think I've mentioned that already. Indeed we are, and the president has said so, as well as other leaders of industry have said the same. The real other question we wanted to ask, therefore, is how long will the load shedding last then? So what we did is we present two scenarios to you to really understand the expected intensity and duration of the load shedding, but more importantly, what options are available or what solutions are there to solve this electricity crisis. So we tried to provide some feasible solutions in the immediate to ensure that we set ourselves up for a successful decade in the 2020s towards 2030. So the burning platform that we're on. South Africa had the worst load shedding, at least in recorded history on record in 2019, 1,352 gigawatt hours, based on the data that we get from public domain sources. And in December 2019, we had up to stage 6 load shedding, which we had not seen before. Until 2020, where we then actually did increase the amount of load shedding relative to 2019, only marginally so far, but halfway through this year, we actually have load shed even more than we did in 2019. We also wanted to say that indeed, load shedding is expected to continue for at least 2 to 3 years. But this is dependent on the key actions and decisions that are taken by the various industry custodians as well as stakeholders. So although there was a reduced demand in 2020, or at least at the beginning half of 2020, due to COVID and the lockdown that was implemented to try and mitigate its spread, this really was only brief and very acute, as you'll start to see in some of the information that we present in the next few slides. So indeed, there is an urgent response that's necessary. We need to ensure short-term system adequacy while setting ourselves up on a path for long-term adequacy in the decade. This is even more urgent now as we start to hear about more and more post-COVID-19 economic recovery plans and how those recovery plans are starting to take shape. Some of the key systemic changes that we highlighted in this research is one, around the Eskom availability of the predominantly the coal fleet, otherwise known as the energy availability factor, the EAF. And then number two, the demand forecast. That did require an updated understanding of what those two key parameters would have in terms of the outcomes and the adequacy in the South African power system over the next 5 years. So what we then looked at was, well, in the last 5 months, 6 months, what happened? And as you can see here, there's a lot of colors, a lot of graphics, but if you just focus on the red curve at the top, that's what Eskom originally expected for at least from March until August for this year in terms of the system demand. In the order of about 33 gigawatts peak. But as you saw there, as that level 5 lockdown started in that red shaded area, the demand really just collapsed down to 30.7 gigawatts relative to what was originally expected at 33.4 gigawatts. But probably more importantly here is the minimum demand and how far that went down. It went all the way down to 13.8 gigawatts. It might not sound like such a bad thing. Reduced demand is a good thing. When we have a largely inflexible and aging coal fleet that then can't really turn down, it becomes quite difficult to manage a system like that. You may have additional operating reserves, but your supply side and the power generators on the supply side are not necessarily flexible enough to turn down sufficiently, so there can be challenges there. If we just zoom in on exactly that area in level 5 in the red, level 4 in sort of the orange yellow color, and then level 3 in the much lighter color, you can start to see that during level 5, we had a deviation of up to 11 gigawatts. A lot of power came off the power system, largely due to industry shutting down. And then under level 4, up to 8.5 gigawatts. During that period, or during this period that you're seeing here, 20 weeks, the expectation was around 86 terawatt hours, whereas there was only 75 terawatt hours of demand. So there was a reduction of about 11 terawatt hours, or 13% relative to what was expected. That's a significant reduction. It has impacts, of course, on Eskom relative to what they were expecting in terms of energy sales, but it also has impacts in the medium to longer term, which we'll start to talk about in the next few slides when we talk to the scenarios that we explored. So I just zoomed in here, 3 slides on level 5, level 4, and level 3. Under level 5, it was 35 days. And there you start to see that reduction down to the 13.8 gigawatts that I was talking to. Interestingly enough, during the beginning part of the lockdown, you didn't really see any systemic patterns coming through. But towards the end of level 5 there, you can see that during the week, the demand profile really started to shift in the mornings where you see those peaks every day. And when you go now to level 4, you even see that further. During the weekdays, you see that in all of those weeks there's that changing demand profile pattern. That's largely because a significant component of South Africa, people that were working in office buildings and in commercial environments as well as in industry were now working from home. So the whole demand profile also started to shift. It wasn't necessarily systemic and is not systemic, but it was just interesting to see that if you start to look at a workforce of the future and where we could be going towards, this is what a different type of a demand profile could start to look like. So it's almost a postcard from the future to show us what the demand profile could start to look like. When you then look at level 3, you can see very minimal differences. Demand has come back to what we could call normal. And then in that blue highlighted area, there's that week of load shedding that we had. We had stage 1 and stage 2 load shedding because the demand did come back. And on the supply side, there wasn't sufficient capacity to meet the demand. Even though we were running open cycle gas turbines quite hard, they can only run for so long. This is then what it looked like in the first 6 months of the year in terms of load shedding. From green to red, the differentiation across the different stages. You can see, and if you remember, the beginning of the year, all the way up to March, we went up to stage 4 load shedding. And then when we look in July, we had that brief period in the middle of July where we had stage 1 and stage 2 load shedding. So that's the year so far. As I said before, 2019 was the worst year of load shedding. 2020 seems to be worse than that so far, after 6 months, about 7 months actually, in this period that we're showing here. We had about 1,383 gigawatt hours of load shedding so far in 2020 relative to 2019. And then of course, 2015 was also quite high, also around 1,300. So this is some information we extracted from Eskom's weekly report, system adequacy report, as well as the system status report that they presented in May. And if you look at the dark blue, those are the actuals and what the country's demand looked like on a weekly basis. The gray area is the deviation relative to what was expected. And then the light blue is what is to come. And what you can see that throughout the year, that 12 terawatt hours of electricity is about a reduction of just under 6% for the entire year in terms of energy sales for Eskom. So that reduction was there, the demand came back, but that reduction really does take a chunk out of the energy demand across the country relative to what was expected. So why did we do this work? Now that I've spoken a bit about COVID and the differentiation between the work we did in January and today. The Integrated Resource Plan was released in October 2019. In that document, there was a highlighting of the short-term inadequacy of the power system between 2019 and 2022. And this is primarily due to the lead time of the first new build capacity that you can get online from 2023 onwards. And a month later, there was another document that gets released annually as well called the Medium-Term System Adequacy Outlook, published by Eskom. And in that document, there was also a risk of inadequacy in the power system if the EAF fell below 72% between this time horizon, 2019 to 2024. There were no investments made to correct for that. And we really wanted to get a feel for what can you use to fill that gap in the interim to ensure that the system is adequate. So just to highlight on the EAF side, the energy availability factor side, some historical views as to where the EAF came from. The solid gray curve is what you can see there, is where we've come from since 2001. It's reduced down from above 90% to 67% in 2019. The dotted curves are all projections from previous publications of the draft RP, as well as a medium-term system adequacy outlook. And in those, it does not seem like the EAF has been realized relative to the expectations at the time. You can see that, for example, with the red, the green, and the black curves from the draft RP 2018, where the EAF has not met those expectations, has actually reduced and gone in the opposite direction. Similarly, if you look at the RP 2019 curve, that's the dashed black line, you start to see the expectation of EAF going towards 75.5% by 2023. In the medium-term system adequacy outlook, that other document that we just spoke about in the previous slide, there were three trajectories, a pretty good one called MES1 low, and there was one called MES1 high, and another one called MES2 high. The MES is minimum emission standards and is aligned to the information in the MTSAO, but you can see the differentiation between those scenarios is that in the green curve, there was really an expectation for the EAF to decline over time, whereas in the orange one, it's more to increase over time. What we did is we took this information and we collated it into the scenario that we're going to show relative to the RP 2019. Maybe just to give you a quick view on a bit more detail on a weekly basis, you can see the actual performance all the way up to week 31, last week, this year so far. The EAF is at 66.1%, that is the average for the year, relative to an expectation, as I showed in the previous slides, above 70%. So the scenarios that we explored is, if you look at it on two axes, and the vertical axis, the demand forecast and what that demand is expected to look like, and then on the horizontal axis, the energy availability factor. So the RP 2019 assumes a bit of a higher demand forecast, so it's in that top right and a higher EAF. The updated scenario that we'll be showing you is on the lower left, top right, sorry, and then the updated scenario is on the lower left, which is a much lower demand forecast and of course a lower EAF expectation. And what that looks like on the left-hand side here is the blue dotted curve is that updated scenario, the black dotted curve being the RP scenario. Similarly on the demand forecast. And I'll just quickly superimpose with that red line there what we've done so far in 2020. That's 66% EAF so far. So it seems like the EAF is tracking the lower bound as opposed to the upper bound. But we thought we would explore both to show the differentiations between these two scenarios and therefore what needs to be done in the immediate as well as in the medium to long term. This is then what it looks like in summary. If we just look on the left-hand side, this is capacity in gigawatts. It's a very familiar number that most people are quite happy with. They're very familiar with the 1,000 megawatts per stage of load shedding. And as we've shown there, stage 1, 2, 3, all the way up to stage 8, just to give you a feel for what that looks like. The gray is historicals. So it just gives you a feel for how we benchmark the modeling that we've done. And then the black is projections at the time. So you can see that in terms of capacity shortages that we should be expecting, in 2020, we didn't expect too much of a shortage in the RP scenario. In 2021, it would be slightly higher. In 2022, a little bit higher than that, but not too much higher. It's more around 5 to 6 gigawatts at that stage. That shortage then starts to fall away as the RP capacity starts to come online. That's wind, solar, the expected coal new build, as well as some gas and storage. And you start to see those shortages fall away. On the right-hand side of the curve, you see the energy shortage. So this is more a description of the intensity of the load shedding. So how long it's expected to last, how many hours throughout the year it's expected to last. And you can see that in this particular scenario, in the RP scenario, there aren't expected to be too many extended periods of load shedding throughout the year. There's a very different picture when you look at the updated scenario, which we'll go into the next slide after this. But I thought I would just show you a typical daily profile. On the right-hand side is a typical demand profile for the country, a winter day and a weekday and a winter weekend, as well as a summer weekday and a summer weekend. And then on the left side of the curve, you start to see the shortages that we could expect on an hourly basis through the years from 2018 to 2025. And as you can see in these outcomes, in some of the years, you only have morning and evening peak issues that you have to deal with. The system is only inadequate in those periods. In some of the other years, it actually is also overnight, but less exacerbated. And it's actually also during the high daytime demand hours in some of those years. This, remember, is without any interventions applied. So these are the shortages we could expect if we don't do anything in this RP scenario. What that looks like on a bi-weekly basis, we just plotted 2 weeks here. 1 week with a, let's say, a poor EAF of 64%, and then the next week with a better EAF of 79%. And you can see that in that week where you have poor EAF or availability of the coal fleet, you start to see the use of the open cycle gas turbines. That's that sort of light cream color, which is denoted as diesel. The other colors on that graph is obviously the hydro, the pumped storage, distributed generation in the form of solar PV at this stage, as well as the wind and the utility scale solar PV that's currently on the grid. You see those shortages on the Tuesday, Wednesday, and the Thursday in that week. But then as you head towards the next week, when you have better EAF performance, you have no shortages. So this is just a demonstration of 2 weeks. Of course, we run for the entire year and actually all of the years to 2025. And I thought I would just highlight this for you now, and I'll show at a similar picture for the updated scenario in the next few slides. So this is that picture again, capacity shortage, energy shortage, for the updated scenario now, not the RP scenario, but the updated scenario. And throughout the years to 2025, we can expect shortages of in the order of 6 to 8 gigawatts, or 6,000 to 8,000 megawatts. Those are capacity shortages. That doesn't mean that it's for extended periods, but in this particular scenario, if you look on the right-hand side, the energy shortages that we could expect could be quite significant. A lot more than what was in 2019 by 2020. Of course, it would be a little bit less this year relative to what we're showing here, but it seems to track quite closely considering the data that we were showing you earlier with the actuals. In 2021, it would get quite a bit worse, about 1.5 to twice as bad. So in the order of 2,500 gigawatt hours of load being shed. And then by 2022, worse than that, in the order of 4,500 gigawatts being shed. You'll see that in 2023, 2024, and 2025, that capacity that's part of the RP planning comes online and you have significantly reduced shortages. You only have capacity shortages and not so much on the energy side. Again, this is that picture that I was showing you across the years. You have this bit of a different profile, similar to the RP 2019, but at a higher level, all the way up to 7,000 to 8,000 megawatts of shortages in particular years, specifically in 2020, in 2021, possibly even 22 and 3. Beyond that, you start to have the RP capacity coming online, as I said, and you have reduced levels of shortages. This is that bi-weekly profile again to show you, in the case of a significantly reduced EAF, so you have a very poor EAF in the 1 week and a better EAF in the other week. Even in the scenario, your EAF is so bad that you have shortages across a lot of the days. An EAF of 56% in week 1, and an EAF of 67% in week 2, you start to see shortages throughout the days on both that Monday, the Tuesday, the Wednesday, and the Thursday in that particular week. Even in the second week, when you have improved EAF performance, it's not good enough, and you still have some shortages just on that Sunday, for example, that you need in some of those days to run the expensive open cycle gas turbines as hard as possible. But in some cases, you just can't do enough and you don't have enough, and you will need to load shed. And the system operator would need to shed load in order to keep the system stable. So what we said to ourselves is, well, let's not stop there with the problem. Let's provide some solutions, hopefully. And what we said is, what are the criteria to choose some of these short-term options? Of course, they could be on the supply side, the demand side, or on the storage side. They can be delivered in 1 to 2 years, so a very short lead time. This should include the procurement process, so you shouldn't need an extensive procurement process or lead time. It needs to meet those megawatt needs, remember, on the left-hand side, those capacity shortages, as well as the energy needs, the megawatt hours, on the right-hand side of those curves that I was showing previously. They should be able to be contracted for very short periods of time, 1 to 3 years, or possibly more, at least if they're aligned with the long-term energy mix that's in the IRP. It should be quite easy to implement, so it shouldn't need expensive regulatory changes or reform. That obviously does take time, and we don't necessarily have time. And then in terms of the last 2 items, of course, they need to be aligned with the long-term mix pathways, so the technologies that we choose need to be aligned with that. But the final one that not too many people think about as extensively as the other components is, it shouldn't require significant network expansions or retrofits or augmentation to allow for them to be interconnected. So we should try to use the networks we have as much as possible, both on the transmission side as well as on the distribution side. So this is then the one graphic that we thought we tried to summarize it all. We said there are really just 3 key steps. And when I say just, it's not just 3 key steps, there are 3 big steps that need to be taken, and they all hang together with each other. As part of step 1, we need a significant customer response at scale. And what we mean by that is customers across all segments, residential, small industrial, commercial, agricultural, all the way up to the energy intensive users of the big mining houses in the country, would be able to, would be enabled to install self-supply options in the form of embedded or distributed generation. In addition to that, we had a look at what possibilities there are around the Renewable Energy IPP program and the changing of those PPAs to increase the maximum export capacity to provide additional power on the grid. Those are already operational, so it should be quite easy to do. Step 2 is the well-known Department of Mineral Resources and Energy Risk Mitigation Program. As part of that, what we said to ourselves is, if we do step 1 and we implement the IRP step 3, which I'll talk to next, what is the balance of capacity that's needed to now fill the remaining gap? And we estimated in the order of 1.3 to 2.8 gigawatts of that capacity across the years. More importantly is really around the time frame. So the RFI that went out as part of the DMRE program was at the beginning of the year, and the RFP, I understand, will be coming out in the next few weeks. Once the RFP comes out, preferred bidders would need to bid into that. There would need to be an assessment of those bids. Those bids would then need to get financial close. They would then need to start construction and hopefully be online, what we estimated about 12 months thereafter or 1 year thereafter. As you can see, though, in that timeline that we've shown, the preferred bidders would only come online at the beginning of 2022, which means in 2021, there will be shortages if we don't do enough in the other steps. So for example, if you do more in step 1, you need to do less in step 2. Similarly, if you do more in step 3, you need to do less in step 2. So all of these hang together. And then finally, as part of the final step is really implementing of existing policy around the IRP 2019. We've listed all of the capacity that's expected to come online, of which the first new build is 1.6 gigawatts of wind, 1 gigawatt of PV, and 500 megawatts of storage. As part of that program, very similar to the previous REIPP program, but it would be, of course, across the various technologies that are expected to be procured. As you see in the graphic, that includes gas, that includes new build coal, as well as 500 megawatts of distributed generation and embedded generation per year as well. But part of that means that when you look at that curve, the first capacity is only expected to come online from 2023, even though we need it in 2022 already. So that really is a risk that we needed to highlight as part of this work. We need to be moving faster. We need to be doing more, because if we can't get step 2 or step 1 implemented quicker, we need to be doing more as part of step 3, for example. And I'll just show 2 quick slides around the IRP and the implementation of those interventions. So the curve on the left includes step 1. The curve on the right includes step 1 as well as step 2. It ensures a much more adequate power system and reduced levels of shortage. This is in the IRP scenario, if you remember. And then in the updated scenario, there's really capacity shortages in some of those days when you only implement step 1. But if you do step 2 as well, you start to see that filling of the gap to ensure that the system is more adequate and you don't have any shortages. So I'll just summarize here and then go on to the final slide. But if we just look at those 3 steps and the decisions or actions that are needed, as well as the possible impact that they could have, there needs to be an immediate focus on this customer response at scale. So the self-supply options across all customer segments via the enabling regulations and or via incentive programs. And this will largely be driven by the large industrial users in terms of scale, but also the many numbers that you'll get across the commercial and small industrial as well as residential sector if they start to install self-supply options. Now, by no means do we say that you go off grid. It's just self-supply options to supplement existing grid capacity that you have in your existing grid connections that you have. The impact of that is an immediate reduced load shedding, as the capacity can come online quite quickly already in 2020. And we would hope that a lot of that capacity is already being installed, but I think there's a lot more that can be done there. But further assistance thereafter from 2021 onwards. Then as part of step 2 is accelerating of the DMRE risk mitigation process to then address the remaining gap. As we highlighted, though, the capacity is only expected to come online from 2022, possibly mid-2021 if we really push it, depending on what the request for proposals looks like in the coming weeks as part of that process. That will assist in further reducing the load shedding, but it doesn't ameliorate it completely. And that's where step 3 comes in, which is an immediate focus on implementing of the IRP, the ministerial determinations and concurrence of that by NERSA. That seems to have been done, so that's very good. And following that would be an immediate implementation of the procurement process to now get that capacity online on the grid to ensure that we reduce the levels of load shedding. As I said again, though, as similar to step 2, that capacity is only expected to be online from 2023 onwards, but it's actually required in 2022. So we need to really fast track some of those processes, more than they possibly are even being fast tracked at the moment. So finally, just 3 key points that I think would be important to remember. It is implicit in the work that we are publishing here that we need to ensure that the existing capacity, the capacity that's being constructed at the moment is delivered as planned. So that's Medupi and Kusile being finalized. And of course, the RERPP procurement program capacity that's being built needs to be delivered on time. Secondly, it's implicit as well that the EAF does need to recover. We need to get it back to realistic levels whilst ensuring value for money. So we don't want to keep spending money in an area where the EAF would just continue to decline. There is a value for money discussion to be had there. And then finally, implement or enable or incentivize these 3 steps that we're highlighting as part of this research with urgency. So the step 1 being the customer responsive scale, step 2 being addressing the remaining gap with the risk mitigation program from the Department of Energy, Mineral Resources and Energy. And then step 3 is the continued and rolling implementation of the IRP as an immediate focus to ensure that we have a successful decade and set ourselves up for a successful 2020. So thank you for your time. I'm going to just ask you, if you do have time as attendees, to download this presentation and go and have a look at some of our thinking around crowdfunding of energy research in South Africa. You can go to a survey and just see what and respond to it, and we'd really like to hear your views. So thank you.
Thanks, Jared. That certainly clarifies the reality of the supply crisis and also the need for urgent and collaborative action. We'll now be running the Q&A session based on the audience's collated responses. The first question, what role does new energy generation play in the post-COVID-19 economic recovery?
Maybe I could ask for a bit of a clarification as to what is more specifically meant by new energy generation. I would assume modern technologies that haven't been applied in South Africa. If that is the case, I think there's a big role for new energy carriers to play, like solar PV and wind. There's a small role that they're playing at the moment, about 5 to 6% in the energy mix. But it is expected as part of our RRP that that role is going to increase quite significantly. The role of our existing coal fleet is expected to reduce over time towards 2030, down towards just below 60% of the energy mix, of which at the moment it's just above 80%. So the other technologies around that, I would say biomass, biogas, exploring of the opportunities as it relates to small modular nuclear reactors could be something we need to explore quite carefully. And I think the RFI and possible RFP that informs that would be very useful to ensure that in terms of our next iteration of the RFP, we have better cost characteristics of those types of technologies to ensure that we then make the best long-term decisions and decisions of least regret.
Question. How can we shorten the time frames that you presented in those 3 critical actions?
I think the key custodians that we highlighted in those slides would be best positioned to answer. But having said that, I think the bottlenecks as it relates to the regulatory framework and the time that it takes to ensure that we're getting embedded generators or distributed generators onto the grid is reduced as much as possible. I think the governance that sits around the large-scale programs, so implementing of the utility scale RP capacity, as well as then the DMRE risk mitigation program, could be accelerated quite significantly. How? I think there's ways in which you can avoid a lot of bureaucracy whilst ensuring we go through the relevant governance processes. I think there's more than enough capabilities in that country to ensure that if there is shortages in capacity, human capacity within institutions, that institutions like CSIR, institutions like GreenCape, businesses, other stakeholders, in the industry associations could really try to drive and accelerate those timelines to ensure that we get the capacity online earlier than expected. And as I said, of those 3 steps, if you do less in one, you need to do more in the others. So it may be that if we are slower at implementing step 2 and 3, which is the DMRE risk mitigation program and the RP, that we need to do a lot more on the embedded generation and distributed generation side. And having that be much more accelerated, having much more streamlined processes to enable the capacity to come online a lot quicker than we would expect.
What does running the off-cycle gas turbines mean for the cost of energy in South Africa?
So running the open cycle gas turbines quite hard relative to their design characteristics is quite expensive. It is expensive energy, it's diesel fueled. So on a rand per kilowatt hour basis, it's a lot more expensive than running your base supply type of technologies. And for the most part, it would, if you compare it to a base case like we did, you run the open cycle gas turbines harder, it increases the tariff. By how much depends on how hard they run. But for the most part, Eskom budget for this every year. And it seems, at least for the 2019-20 year, that they landed on the budget they expected. I'm not sure as to how much the open cycle gas turbines have been run this year so far, but we have received some data from Eskom on that, and we'll be doing some analysis on it to see how hard they have been running, and perhaps even look at what the Eskom summer plan will start to look like and what the expectations are around how hard those open cycle gas turbines will be running. Because the energy is expensive, but it should not be and does not typically run for extended periods of time. It's only in very exceptional circumstances.
Eskom CEO Andre de Ruyter says he will soon present directors with a revised timetable for Eskom's split with the aim of opening the way for investment. What does this mean for the energy landscape in South Africa?
In summary, more stakeholders, less risk within one individual entity, spreading of the risk across various industry players, so probably a very good thing. There are various ways in which this can be done, of course, and there are various, I would say, examples internationally in which would be applicable to South Africa. I think what's probably most important is that it will stimulate investment. It will probably be in the form of private sector investment, but it's also important to understand the differentiation between the different functions in the supply chain. So the generation, transmission and distribution and operations, as well as the retail environment. Not all of that will be in the private sector. For the most part, the transmission networks and grids will likely remain in the public sector and probably should. But on the generation side, it should definitely be more competitive, and the private sector can enable that to happen.
Is the energy available factor quoted in all of the analyses of the whole ESCOM fleet, or specifically the ESCOM coal fleet? What is the relationship between energy availability factor of the whole fleet versus the energy factor of the coal fleet only?
Yeah, good question. So we have an expression, the way that we're presenting the data here is on the energy availability factor of the entire fleet. So when you then focus down into just the coal fleet is a little bit lower than the average. And more specifically within that coal fleet, there are stations that are very, very bad. And then there are stations that are quite good. So it's not necessarily very homogeneous. But generally speaking, the EAF information that we're presenting and the information that we also have from previous published documentation from ESCOM is that the coal fleet is slightly lower in terms of its EAF relative to the overall system and fleet EAF, which includes the likes of the open cycle gas turbines, the nuclear capacity at Coburg, as well as imports and other capacity that is on the grid.
Can you comment on the role of local municipalities in the future energy landscape?
I think the role of municipalities would need to increase, specifically as part of that step one, that's on the distributed generation and embedded generation side, whether it's in the form of customers in their jurisdictions starting to self-supply some of their energy needs, or in the form of municipalities taking up PPAs with independent power producers and doing something very similar that ESCOM are doing with the utility scale renewable IPP program. Of course, there are, I guess, constraints and barriers at this stage around that, and there's been some movement around what the city of Cape Town is doing, but I think there should be an increased role for municipalities to play in that space, as long as they are financially sustainable, of course, and can show that there is value for money for the investment that's being made, as well as then for incentivizing customers to respond in the way that they do to ensure that they can have secure and reliable energy supply.
Would the use of different time zones in South Africa help to mitigate the shortage in the short term?
This is quite an interesting one that I haven't explored very recently, but did a while ago myself. And the interesting part of this, after having some discussions with some system operations people, is that for the most part, the economic activity sits in the east part of the country in Gauteng and KZN. So even if you start to shift the time zones across the country, most of the people that then, for example, would be in the Western Cape or Northern Cape or Eastern Cape would actually interact with people in that economic hub anyway. So that demand profile won't necessarily change as much as you would think. It could help slightly, but my understanding is it won't help as much as most think, but possibly something for consideration.
Assuming we could get a few 100 megawatts of private storage onto the grid quickly, in say 2 years' time, and you say we have an energy shortage, would there be enough recharge energy available?
Yeah, so that is an important question. I think storage could help, particularly for municipalities at their intake points. But as the question is alluding to, storage is not a primary energy provider. Storage just shifts the energy around and recycles it. So depending on if those steps are implemented and there is enough energy around, storage could play a role. What we've seen though, in terms of the cost trajectory, is it is not necessarily quite there in terms of the investment, but we would need to see some real numbers that come out of either this DMRE risk mitigation program or the first 500 megawatts of storage that's expected as part of the IRP, to see where those costs land in South Africa specifically. Internationally, the trend is definitely downwards and is very economical in particular environments. There are examples where existing supply capacity has been replaced with the combination of solar and storage, for example, where you have that primary energy provider coupled with the storage, and then on a levelized basis, the energy is very competitive to other capacity and energy providers. So in summary, yes, it would help, but it is a function of how the other steps are implemented to ensure that there's sufficient energy in the power system to then be shifted around to when it's needed the most in the morning or in the evenings.
Have you done any modeling around time of use tariffs in the residential space to middle and income users? And what is your opinion on the impact this could have?
I think time of use tariffs would likely shift as a function of the mix shifting and how the demand changes. So I can't say we've done specific analyses on that yet, but we have a few, I guess, efforts within the CSIR where we're trying to get an understanding of what the cost reflectivity of the tariff should look like for different types of customers, whether it's residential or commercial or industrial. And then whether there is value in shifting that time of use charge, whether it's the energy charge as well as even making the maximum demand charge time of use tariff. But we haven't done too much detail yet. So in summary, no, but it is forthcoming, I would say.
Okay, thanks, Jared. There aren't any more questions coming in, but you've been very comprehensive in covering the ones that have come in. As I mentioned earlier, this event has been recorded and a link will be made for sharing afterwards. Should you have any further questions we were not able to address, or would like information and support in getting off the ground with an embedded generation or rooftop PV project, or need assistance in understanding, tracking, and leveraging the procurement processes, I would encourage you to reach out to me via my GreenCape email address, from which you would have received the webinar link. Beyond that, thank you for joining us. And that's all for today. Thanks. Goodbye.
Thank you.